issue. So, on my far right, we have Xavier, I think, Helgesen,
Xavier, yeah.
who is engaged in solar technologies, and Christofer Mowry on my immediate right, who is talking about fusion. And I'm going to start off. These are in some ways very different ends of a spectrum of possible new models. And I'm going to start off by asking each of them to introduce very quickly what it is that you're working on right now.
Absolutely. So OffGrid Electric is a distributed solar company operating in Africa on a mission to deliver cheaper, reliable, and universally accessible power. Thing to know about us is that there are more people off the grid today than in Edison's time. So population growth has actually exceeded our ability to electrify. And so that's over 1 billion people, and then probably double that for people that don't have reliable power. So what we do is we make solar super affordable through financing. We make it plug and play, so you can install it with minimal technical expertise. And we make it scalable, so you can scale up from very, very small use cases up to the lifestyle you and I enjoy.
Christofer.
Well, good morning. So I'm the Chief Executive Officer for General Fusion, and I just think General Fusion is the most exciting thing I've ever done. If you stop to think about it, all of us are here because of fusion. Fusion energy, fusion power is the way the universe made us. All of us are made up of elements that come from fusion out of the stars. All the energy that the world gets in whatever form we're talking about comes from the fusion power of the sun. And what we're trying to do at General Fusion is bring that fusion energy technology that nature has figured out in each and every star and bring it down to Earth in a way that we can use it and create clean, unlimited form of energy for the future.
You might say that since the sun is the biggest fusion generator of power, that we're already using its power in solar panels. Why do we need to replicate the sun on Earth?
Well, my view is that there's no single solution for the world's energy needs. Some areas where you don't have access to big power grids, where there's not a lot of people, you need more micro-generation and easily deployable forms of electricity. But by the end of the century, most people are going to be living in mega cities, 20, 30 million people living there, and you need a very concentrated source of clean energy to power those cities. And only fusion energy really has that opportunity. Fusion actually is, even if you forget about the nuclear waste issues with nuclear fission, fusion energy is 100 times more concentrated than traditional nuclear power. And so that is something that makes it incredibly powerful when you think about how to provide electricity to all of these growing cities.
It's very powerful when the sun does it, but we have been waiting for fusion to work on Earth for 30 years, 40 years, and it's always another 20 years ahead. What is it that makes you think now? And there have been big projects that have looked at this over a long time. And the problem, as I understand it, and I don't have your expertise, but that you have to put in more energy than you get out in all of these experiments so far. What is it that makes you think it's going to work? Is it just, it's not like the alchemist promising to turn lead into gold, or,
Well, we know that fusion works. All you have to do is look up in the sky.
In terms of solving our problem here.
But so the challenge is, of course, that the sun is 500,000 miles wide, and so it's got a lot of things going for it. The question is, how do you make fusion work on a human scale? And what we're doing now actually builds on this legacy of 20, 30, 40 years of basic science, but also combining it with other enabling technologies that have emerged over the past 10 or 12 years. I think the biggest thing that we're interested in is big data, and we actually have a very interesting project going on with Microsoft right now to mine all of the information that's out there, especially with our company, to intuit new ways of understanding the path forward. And then more broadly, the computing power to do detailed modeling and simulation to actually help us do these designs. So the broader range of technologies that are necessary to make practical fusion work really haven't been around until very recently, and it is only recently in the last 5 or 10 years that you see innovation really happening in fusion space and this growth around the world of private fusion companies.
We should maybe make the point that fusion doesn't produce waste in the same way that fission does.
Yeah.
So to that extent,
fusion power is the ultimate form of zero carbon, no waste, and infinite supply of fuel, because basically it uses seawater. That's where the fuel comes from.
Right. So Xavier, you're at the other end of the solar range, if you like. You're taking what is given to us and generating electricity through it. Do you see yourself at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, of this whole conundrum about which technologies are going to contribute most?
I do and I don't. First of all, invest in this. I mean, this is incredibly important stuff, what they're building with fusion. And we need clean power. We need hundreds of times more than we produce today. So I'm a bit of a pragmatist about all this. And for me, it hits my heart when I think about kids burning jet fuel in little kerosene lamps and then trying to study in front of those for hours at night. I can't spend 10 minutes around a kerosene lamp without getting a headache and having to leave. And this is still the default state of affairs. We're talking about $20 billion of jet fuel burned in African living rooms just to provide light, and less light than a 1-watt LED light bulb can provide. So we have an urgent issue to solve here, but we also have something really interesting. So you think about the carbon emissions thing we have to solve. So let's just imagine we're all driving Teslas, our homes are powered by fusion. In US and Europe, we're sorted. And none of that is going to matter if the average African and the average Indian goes on their present energy path and consumes as much electricity as we do. The planet's cooked. So our fundamental mission today is to make everyone's cheaper and more reliable choice more solar and more storage rather than anything else. Whether that's a coal plant or a natural gas plant it can be very important for an energy mix in a developing country, but also can be very expensive to build, can take a very long time. We actually do have the technology we need today to immediately solve this problem and solve it at scale. We serve over half a million people get light just from my company's services today. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we operate in only 3 African countries. We don't even cover those entirely. So there is a solar revolution happening today in Africa, and it's happening because of cheap solar, cheaper storage, but also mobile payments and networking. And it's thrilling to see it happen and how much progress has happened in a few years.
So does that mean that Africa can develop an energy system that never, takes it down the road of coal or takes it down the road of big fossil fuels?
My view is absolutely, and it's a networked system. And we forget how much capital we've already invested in the U.S. and Europe. I mean, it's in the trillions in our big electrical machine that gives us all this power, and so that capital will be invested there. There is a huge need for baseload too, especially as industries build and develop. And so I don't want to sell that short, but I also want to expand people's thinking of just as what is possible. I don't know the exact number, so forgive me if this is wrong, but I've heard that about 50% of the electricity produced in the US is not consumed because we have something like 10 minutes of storage on the grid, right? So we have a lot of power that just is curtailed or is unneeded in the middle of the night.
Curtailed means it's produced, but it's not taken onto the grid.
Yeah, it's not used in an effective form. Hopefully electrical cars will solve some of that. I think the most interesting story in Africa and India in the next 10 years is going to be networks of distributed storage that can actually push power back onto the grid. So they can be a virtual power plant. And rather than, again, will this solve all the problems? No, but it'll make it a lot better than it is today, where you have constant blackouts in many of these countries.
So the argument that I hear against renewables and for fossil fuels is that that's fine when the sun shines, it's fine when the wind blows, but the whole system needs baseload power, and the cheapest form is coal and oil and all that stuff. What's your response to that? Because people need power 24 hours a day.
They do, and my response is that the cost curve of storage and its value to the grid has not been fully internalized and conceived in that thinking. So my rough math around this is that, and this is backed by RMI and some other people who've looked at this, is that the batteries could essentially be given nearly for free to households if the grid were to pay their value for being on the grid. because the ability to push power into the grid or pull power off the grid at any time
Right.
at a household, at an endpoint level, rather than a centralized level, is incredibly important. And that systematically reduces costs because you need less big wires all the way down the line, hundreds of miles from the big power plant to the consumer's home.
Right, so equally important to the innovation in technology is the way we distribute, the way we store, how close the source is to the consumer.
That's exactly it. I mean, if we just think of solar panels, then that thesis is completely right. Sometimes the sun shines, sometimes it doesn't, it's
Right.
unpredictable. If we think about network storage and we think about solar as just one cheap source of electrons with no transmission and distribution costs,
Right.
then it becomes an interesting system. And so we're talking to some folks now about doing a big report on this where we basically do the number crunching and say what is the true low cost model for a country that has minimal electrical infrastructure built to have 24/7 cheap, reliable power, because that's the only reason we should be in business, any of us should be in business.
So I heard this morning that new areas of the oceans around the US are being opened up for oil exploration. Is this a crazy move? I mean, are these going to be stranded assets? Christofer, do you think we will, if you were saying the point at which we really don't need fossil fuels, they're uneconomic, they're polluting, what's that moment for you?
Well, I think given how ubiquitous fossil fuels are and petroleum is across our economy, it's not going to turn off tomorrow. I think for those of us who care about climate and the environment, the goal is to reduce that as quickly as possible. So, my view on this is that the use of fossil fuels, oil, gas, whatever, is going to be managed on the demand side, not on the supply side, right? And there is, I'm sure, lots of locations around the world that have never been tapped for the resources that exist there in terms of hydrocarbons. So it's not so much whether you, quote unquote, make them available or not, it's more on the demand side, right? And so that's where you see a lot of change happening. In the US, for example, I read an article, I think it was last week, that said that actually there are more people employed in the US in the solar industry than in coal.
Absolutely,
right?
and there's more investment now
right?
in
And so,
renewables.
exactly, and so, you can do whatever you want to, quote unquote, try to bring back coal, but people are only going to mine coal if there's use for it and a demand for it. And I think you see on the demand side, industry and the world broadly making this shift, and that will naturally drive this transition.
Right, but
So
a lot
it's
of what we hear in this discussion is about what's cheapest, what's too expensive, what needs subsidies. The big criticism of renewables was that it had to be subsidized. Fusion sounds pretty expensive to me. Is this a technology that's going to have state investment, that's going to have subsidy to make it viable?
It shouldn't, in principle, it shouldn't need that. But I guess at the end of the day, if you put all of these things broadly in the same bucket and say you're doing this because you have a policy objective, broadly speaking, right? So society has an objective to manage the amount of carbon it emits, right? And so that's a policy objective, and subsidies are just a way of driving policy broadly, right? And so the coal industry gets subsidized in its own way. Every industry, whether explicitly or implicitly, is subsidized because of special interests and the way they turn into government policy and programs and funding and this type of thing. So I don't think you can say, well, okay, this technology has zero funding, this technology is subsidized. You really can't look at it that way. But the goal ought to be for a technology to be competitive within a policy neutral playing field, as opposed to one that favors a specific technical solution. And I think that's the big learning, I would say broadly in clean tech over the past 25 years, is that government moved from trying to drive policy to trying to reach out into industry and make technology decisions. And I think pretty much everybody would agree the government's not very good at making technology decisions. And so what they do is they distort the energy markets, and they drive specific technologies that may not be the right solution on one hand, and on the other hand, they stifle innovation and investment in other areas.
Talking of that, Xavier, solar's been around for a while now, and since the Chinese got into manufacturing, we've seen the price come down by 80% in the last few years. Is there still innovation to happen in solar technology? Is it going to get more productive, more efficient, less polluting in itself?
Short story is absolutely, and it's solar's already pretty damn cheap. I mean, it's, solar panels going to get cheaper and going to get more efficient just because there is such demand for it, and we're going to find more and more use cases for it. I think we're getting to the point solar desalination starts to make sense in certain places, and so there start to be other use cases that will drive demand. Watch batteries too. To me, it's the nexus of solar and batteries and the power controls and electronics and inverters and everything else that sit in the middle of that. And that's the cost of a solar system. Less and less of that is the actual solar panels today, and that used to dwarf the system. And now it's actually permitting and regulation in the U.S. is probably the single biggest cost of installing a new solar system. And you look at a country like Germany, where it doesn't have as many of those hassles, and it's half the cost to install it there.
I'd like to just add on to what he said. One of my biggest concerns going forward here is people will jump on, for example, the electric vehicle bandwagon and think, oh, that's great, I'm doing absolutely the right thing, problem solved. When in reality, you have to look at, hey, where did that electricity come from, right? Did it come from solar?
Right.
Did it come from some carbon-free source of base load like fusion, or did it just come from a coal plant?
Yeah.
So you just moved the problem from your internal combustion gasoline-powered engine to the big baseload coal plant, and you haven't made anything any better. And the same thing with battery storage. So battery and any type of storage device for the grid is only as good as the source of the electricity that it comes from.
Right. Do you see in let's say 50 years' time, your industry killing off Xavier's industry?
Not at all. This is a complementary approach to energy. There is no silver bullet. If you live in, as I have in Scandinavia, you realize there's a lot of cloudy days in the winter, right? And so,
but lots of hydro.
So, solar isn't necessarily, regardless of the cost of it, you just can't go for 3 weeks without any baseload power, right? Same thing, if you look at megacity, you just need a highly dense form of energy. On the other hand, if you go into the areas that Xavier is talking about, you just don't have the infrastructure in place, and you don't have the total amount of demand need that would ever justify putting in a large fusion plant. So it's a very complementary solution.
Okay, so we're facing some adverse policy headwinds, I would say, right now, particularly here in the US. Are we going to make it?
Absolutely.
Economics are going to drive it. I mean, it's a big world, and good solutions find a home. And I think some of the policies will hurt the U.S. Clean tech industry. Some may help it. We'll see.
It's great to hear. So Xavier, Chris, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.